All right, everybody, we are going to go ahead and finish up our last chapter for Unit 5, which is Chapter 17. This chapter has some new information, but a lot of it should be familiar to you from our previous units, especially way back in the beginning in Unit 1. So I'll definitely highlight some of the stuff that we have already covered. Obviously, I'll highlight the new information that's really need to know and likely going to show up on your test. And as always, I'll try to highlight the nice to know information that gives us some context, but you probably don't need to worry about seeing that on an exam. So let's go ahead and get into this. So nutrition can be kind of complicated, or there's a lot of different opinions on nutrition. We're going to keep it to the basics. And so nutrition itself is the actual process by which food is taken into and used in the body. And if you think back to our digestive system lecture, that's going to include digestion, absorption. Remember, that's when our nutrients are moving into the bloodstream or lymphatic system, the transport, and then the actual metabolism, or how we're using the food. The study of nutrition is going to involve our food and drink requirements for normal body function. So what you see on stuff like labels, and what's recommended for a healthy diet is based off of what we need for normal body function, and we'll talk about that stuff a little bit further down the chapter. Now, nutrients are those chemicals that are taken into the body. They're typically being used to provide energy. And really, what we end up doing during the digestive process is breaking those nutrients down into their building blocks, which we can use as material for new molecules that the body needs. All right, some of you may have heard of my plate without realizing it, or even seen some of the graphics of the MyPlate. It's been around since 2011. And so every 5 years, our U.S. Department of Health and Human Services, HHS, and the Department of Ag, USDA, I should say Agriculture, the Department of Ag, so jointly are going to make recommendations to what is a healthy diet. And so if you remember way back, there used to be the food pyramid. So you had your foods that you should have more often on the bottom, and then as you got closer to the top, you kind of cut down. That got replaced by My Plate. And so you may have seen this in your schools growing up in the cafeteria and the hallways. And so it's just kind of the reason they replaced the My Pyramid with My Plate is that it's a simpler visual reminder of kind of how to build a healthy meal, and it's a little bit more easy to understand than the pyramid was. And so this is what My Plate looks like. And so the idea is that it's kind of showing what your plate should look like in terms of portion size. And so you can see half of our plate here is fruits and vegetables, and then the other half is our grains and protein. And then we have some dairy in the glass next to it. And so besides that My Plate icon, you can also go to choosemyplate.gov, and that has a ton of information on how to make healthy dietary choices. So if you're interested, take a look at choosemyplate.gov. They have some good resources there. All right, so we're primarily going to talk about our 6 different classes of nutrients. So the first 3 should look very similar to, or very familiar, I should say, to what you've seen previously. We haven't talked a ton about vitamins. We've mentioned them here and there. We haven't really talked a lot about minerals quite yet. And of course, we've talked about water in multiple chapters now. And so a balanced diet is going to consist of a certain percentage of all these different nutrients, because we need all 6 of these for our body to function normally. All right, so an essential nutrient is essential because we have to digest it. Our bodies are not capable of manufacturing them. So, or either, let me backtrack just 1 second. They either can't manufacture them at all, or we can manufacture them. We just can't make enough for what we would need. And so this is going to apply to multiple categories. One of the main ones that you hear it talked about is with amino acids, or our protein building blocks, some fatty acids, pretty much all vitamins. minerals, water, and some carbs. And that's one that you won't see too often talked about with essential nutrients. All right, this can get a little confusing, so bear with me here, try to follow along. So we have calories, and this is a little c calorie. So we'll talk about big C calories in just a second. So this first definition is for a little c, a lowercase c calorie. And so one lowercase c calorie is the amount of energy required to raise the temperature of 1 gram of water 1 degree Celsius. So, and also remember C for calories, C for Celsius. So don't make that Fahrenheit. So that's a little c, a lowercase c calorie. The amount of energy required to raise 1 gram of water 1 degree Celsius. Now, what we communicate with most often is actually kilocalories. So a kcal, which is 1,000 calories. Now we have a uppercase C calories, big C calories. They actually represent kcals. So uppercase C calorie, one uppercase C calorie is the same as one uppercase C kilocalorie, which is the same as 1,000 lowercase c calories. So again, one uppercase c calorie is the same as 1 kilocalorie, which is the same as 1,000 lowercase c calories. So 1,000 of these equals one of these, and we say calories still. But when we write it out, it's got to have that uppercase C because that's how we know it's representing kilocalories. So what you see on our nutrition label is really kilocalories. We just put the uppercase C calories. So if we did lowercase c calories, we'd have to multiply this number by 1,000, and that makes things a lot less easy to kind of digest. Okay, our recommended dietary allowances. So RDAs, recommended dietary allowances, are the nutrient intakes that are going to be sufficient to meet the needs. And these are not kind of just across every person. This is actually going to change based on age, sex. And so we know people are different, so they're going to need different amounts of nutrients. And that's what the RDAs, it's a little bit more individualized. And so we even have RDAs for pregnant and lactating women because obviously the body systems are under a lot higher demand when we are developing the fetus and kind of all the processes our body has to go through for that to happen. All right, daily values are what appear on our food label. So RDAs are, you can look them up, but they do not show up on the food label itself. Daily values show up on our food labels. And so our daily values are based on a 2,000 kilocalorie diet or a 2,000 uppercase C calorie diet. And the general accepted breakdown of this is about 60% carbs, 30% fats, 10% saturated fats, and 10% proteins. And so, first of all, if you're adding those numbers up, you're going to get 110%, but that's because out of that 30% of total fats, only 10% should be saturated. So that's kind of double dipping. That's a subcategory. And you guys do not need to memorize these percentage values, but you should understand that this is what they are basing this percent daily value off of. So our 34 grams of carbs are 12% of the total calories of this 2,000 kilocalorie or uppercase C calorie diet. Now, this is where the debate really comes in. There's very little people that would say 10% protein is really enough protein to build muscle, and 60% carbs is probably a bit high. And then you'd have the keto diet people that think that the fat number should be way higher and this number should really be cut down. So, as I said, we're going to keep it to the basics and just kind of discuss the topics of nutrition, but we're really not going to get into all the different diets. And depending on what source you look at, you're going to see very different things for these percentage breakdowns. All right. we've seen carbs before, so just a reminder, our carbs are going to have carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen, and we're always going to have twice as many hydrogens as oxygens in our carbohydrate structure. And so our building blocks are monosaccharides. We had to know the building blocks back in Unit 1, so that's the one of the main things I want you to remember from our macronutrients. And so we can have monosaccharides, our building block, which is one sugar unit. So glucose is the usable sugar in the body by the cells. It's a monosaccharide. We can have disaccharides, which is two monosaccharides combined. And then something like glycogen, where we have many sugar molecules that are attached to one another, is going to be considered a polysaccharide. And so we said our buzzword with carbs is always going to be energy. They can be converted to glucose pretty quickly. Glucose is used as part of our equation with oxygen to make ATP, which I hope we all know by now is the energy used by our cells. Our brain cells require a lot of glucose, so they're running. They need a lot of fuel. And then if we have excess glucose, that's when glycogen comes in. We take those glucose molecules and attach them together to make glycogen. And that's our stored form of sugar, where we find primarily in the muscles and our liver. If we have extra glucose and we don't need to keep adding up to make more glycogen, we can also store our excess glucose as lipids. So there's a conversion process that we're not going to go into detail on, but you should know that we can also convert glucose into lipids for more long-term storage within our fat tissue. Remember, that's also known as adipose tissue. So you can either have simple or complex carbs. And for the most part, we want to stick with the complex carbs for our diet. So the simple carbs are sugar for a kind of a simple term. So not a lot of nutritional value. Yes, we can convert some of it to energy directly, but for the most part, it's just going to cause us weight gain because we get too much of it at once to do anything with it. So that's what's especially going to be converted into that adipose tissue. Now, our complex carbs are stuff like whole grains, pastas, rice, bread. They typically are going to have fiber in them as well, which helps our net carbs. So, kind of fiber helps capture some of those carbs, and we can get rid of some of that excess. And so that's part of the reason why complex carbs should be eaten at every meal. And we want to kind of avoid simple carbs. So your simple carbs, you want to think more like kind of candy, added sugar to soda, that kind of stuff. So like I said, these percentage numbers can vary a lot in terms of what's recommended, depending on what resource you look at. We, in general, associate our carbohydrate sources with plants. Sometimes people think plants and they immediately think vegetables, which do have carbs, but wheat is a plant, rice is a plant, and that's what really makes a lot of our other carb sources like bread, rice, flour, all that kind of stuff. So in general, our complex carbs are going to come from plants, and they're going to have large amounts of simple sugars. Um, so if we have these foods that have a large amount of simple sugars, they have a ton of carbs, but they have very few other nutrients. So it's going to bring a lot of calories in and take up a lot of our carb percentage without providing us much extra. And so that's a big reason, especially with our obesity crisis, that they really push avoiding those simple carbs and wanting to stick with the complex. All right, now we're moving on to lipids. These are our fats. And so lipids are typically going to be totally or partially insoluble in water. I always think of the example, oil and water don't mix, and that's because oil is a lipid. And so lipids include triglycerides, steroids, phospholipids, and we also have some fat-soluble vitamins, meaning some of our vitamins that we need are going to be able to be transported within our kind of fatty substances. Triglycerides are the primary type of dietary lipid. And so, in terms of the food we eat, about 95% of the fat that we bring in is going to be in the form of triglycerides. And so, when you see the word energy, when we're using it in the short term, we're thinking carbs. Adipose provides long-term energy storage. And so, the liver does that with glycogen as well, but our adipose tissue is what we're focusing on with lipids. It's going to help insulate against heat loss. It's a protective cushion for our organs. Remember, we talked about this a little bit that our important organs like our heart and our lungs are protected by the rib cage, but our abdominal organs are also, of course, important for our function and don't have that bony protection. So that's part of the reason why our adipose tissue tends to go to the abdominal area because it's trying to add extra protection. Cholesterol was something that we mentioned before, and it's super important in our cell membrane structure. So, yes, we don't want crazy high cholesterol, but cholesterol is a very important lipid for the body. All right, our saturated, unsaturated, and trans fats. So our saturated fats are going to only have single bonds between our chains of fatty acids. So the way to remember that is S for saturated, S for single. And these are typically going to be solid at room temperature and what we typically would refer to as fat. So butter is a good example of this, and something like a steak that has like animal fat that is going to be solid. Think of the white part of a steak, that's going to be fat. So that would be a saturated fat. Our unsaturated fats are unsaturated because they have at least one double bond. And so these are going to be liquid at room temperature, and this is primarily going to be our oils. Trans fats are the ones we really want to avoid. And so our unsaturated oils can kind of be converted through this process called hydrogenated. And that's going to make our unsaturated oil a saturated fat. So the reason we want to avoid these is because it's found to raise LDL, low density lipoproteins. That's the bad type of cholesterol or the bad type of lipid that we don't want to see too high in the bloodstream. And it lowers our HDL, our high density, which we do want to have in the bloodstream. And the combination of higher LDL levels and lower HDL levels is a big increased risk for heart and other vascular diseases. And so this is what we were just talking about. LDL, low density lipoprotein, is bad cholesterol. It's going to take cholesterol from our livers to our cells. And the big problem is this right here. It's going to get caught on the walls of our arteries and build up. And that's what we refer to as plaque. Our HDL cholesterol, this is the stuff we want. It's good cholesterol. It's actually going to go the opposite direction. It's going to go from the cells to the liver. And we can also increase this number not just with a better diet, but with more exercise. And so think of low densities, like a big bubble of bad stuff. It's going to get stuck. High density is kind of a wrecking ball of HDL in a good way. It's going to carry cholesterol from our cells to the liver. And because it's high density, it's not going to get stuck. And it can even help try to kind of bring some of those plaques or the low density stuff with it. Okay, different lipid sources. So saturated fats, like I said, if you think of that rule of it being solid at room temperature, makes sense. So meat, dairy products would solidify if we left them out. Like butter is an example of that. Milk would have solids if you didn't refrigerate it. Eggs is an example of this. Nuts also have saturated fats like almonds. So nuts are a high calorie dense food, even though they're relatively healthy because of the fat content. Our monounsaturated fats, such as olive and peanut oils. And then we have polyunsaturated, which is fish, safflower, sunflower, and corn oils. In general, we tend to say that polyunsaturated is preferred to monounsaturated. And the mono versus poly just means we have one double bond versus multiple double bonds. And then, of course, cholesterol itself. If you eat certain organs like the brain or liver, they're very high in cholesterol. The yolk portion of the egg is high in cholesterol. Whole milk, cheese, buttermeat, kind of really anything in our saturated fat world is going to have cholesterol. So we really try to avoid saturated fats. And in general, our goal is only 300 milligrams of cholesterol a day. And we put in parentheses here, that's just one egg yolk. So it doesn't take a whole lot of saturated fats to hit that number. And the main reason, like we kind of discussed above, besides the actual weight gain, is that it's going to start affecting our organs, especially our heart and our arteries. It's also been linked to an increased risk of colon and pancreatic cancer. Now, the keto diet, ketones are something that our body can kind of use for energy based on breakdown of fats, has become very, very, very popular. And so there's definitely ways that you can manage high content of lipids by cutting out some other things. But if you look at my plate and if you look at our government resources, they're going to say keep those lipids on the lower end of things. And especially we're trying to avoid those saturated fats. All right, proteins, our building block is amino acids, and these are going to be found in pretty much any of the plant and animal products that we eat. And so we said proteins are the most important macronutrient because they're going to be used for literally everything that we make in our body. They're responsible for the structure and function of pretty much everything in our body. So skin, hair, nails, muscles, you name it, it's made with proteins. They also act as enzymes. They have very important immune system functions. Our muscles, of course, contraction wise, actin and myosin are protein filaments. And then they also help make up parts of the cell membrane, like our channel proteins, our transport proteins, and some of our other cell markers are made of proteins. So we said, of course, it's found in most of our foods. Animal products are definitely going to have a higher percentage of protein compared to plant products, but you can definitely get plenty of protein in with plant sources. There's 20 amino acids that make up all the different proteins in the body. And so here we see our essential and non-essential designation again. So same exact definition as we touched on in the very beginning. So essential means our body either isn't making these or isn't making enough. So there's 9 essential amino acids. We have to eat these in our diet to have enough. And then the non-essential means that our body can synthesize enough that even if we had 0 of these non-essential acids in our diet, we would be fine. We'd have enough for what we need. So your best protein sources are going to be what we call a complete protein food because it's going to contain all 9 essential amino acids. So we just said there's 9 essential that we have to eat. So if we eat a complete protein food, that means we're going to get all 9 in. And not just going to have all 9, it's going to have all 9 in the proportions we need as well. Most animal proteins are complete. There are plant proteins that are complete, like some soy-based products, and quinoa is another example of a plant-based complete protein. But most of the time, our plant proteins are incomplete. So someone that's vegan or vegetarian has to be a little more careful about the protein sources they're choosing to make sure they're getting all of those essential amino acids. We don't have a way to store proteins and amino acids like we do carbs and lipids. So we need to resupply that every day. And so our recommended amounts are 1 to 2 servings in dairy. So that's going to have a fair bit of protein, but usually a fair bit of fat as well. So we need to be careful there. 1 to 3 servings of nuts or beans. Same thing. Gonna have great protein. Nuts are gonna have higher fat than our beans, so we got to be a little careful with how many nuts we're eating. And then 0 to 2 servings of fish, poultry, eggs, and the recommendation is still only red meat sparingly, and that's partly from the link to heart disease based on the saturated fat content. Okay, Now we're going to get into some of the newer stuff. So the vitamins are going to be organic molecules, and they're usually in relatively small quantities, but we need them for metabolism and a lot of our other body functions. In general, if you eat a balanced diet, you're going to get kind of a wide variety of those vitamins. Most of the time, we don't really talk about having too much of a vitamin. We talk about having not enough. And so typically, if we don't have enough of a specific vitamin, whatever kind of function or pathway that that vitamin assists with or body system is going to then be affected in a negative way. And so we really break our vitamins down into two categories: fat soluble or water soluble. So some of our fat soluble vitamins are A, D, E, and K. Water soluble include B complex, because we have a variety of B vitamins, as well as vitamin C. So again, as soon as we tag that word essential on the front of it, it means that our body is not producing enough of these, and we have to obtain these through our diet. Provitamin is a portion of a vitamin that our body can assemble or modify into a functional vitamin. So one of kind of the best example of this that we've hit on a couple times is that our body has to convert vitamin D into the active form of vitamin D, which is activated by sunlight. And there's a few other stops along the way to get vitamin D to a form we can actually use it. The reason vitamins are important is because they tend to function as coenzymes, which means they're going to help our proteins, our enzymes, and make them more efficient and really make them functional in the body. So without the vitamins as our coenzymes, our regular enzymes are not going to function properly. Our next category here is minerals. These are going to be inorganic nutrients. So if you need a reminder on organic and inorganic, pop back over to our Unit 1 lectures. And so we have a lot of different minerals. So calcium, chlorine, chromium, cobalt. I'm not going to read all of these to you, but in a sense, if you find them on the periodic table, it's a mineral. Okay, let's just talk a little bit about metabolism. And so the word metabolism really means the total or sum of all the chemical reactions that occur in the body. So everything that happens in the body all day long is going to be metabolism. So when someone says they have a fast metabolism or a slow metabolism, what they're referring to is kind of what their basal metabolic rate, which we'll see in a second, what their body is doing at rest. Are they burning more calories at rest, or are they burning less calories at rest compared to the average? Now, catabolism and anabolism, if we added these two up, that's what gets us this total number. And so catabolism, think this T is going to be our plus sign. Oh, I'm sorry. Catabolism, I always say cats like to knock things over. So this is going to be our energy releasing process. So we have large molecules being broken down into smaller ones. So anytime we're breaking a bond, we're going to release energy. Anabolism is what is going to actually build molecules up. So this is when we're taking our building blocks and building a more complex structure. And so to make bonds, to build something, we're going to require energy. So if we have more catabolic reactions than anabolic reactions, that means more energy is going to be released. If we have more anabolic reactions than catabolic reactions, that means we're going to need more energy to be able to do that. All right, this is a good summary slide. It's a little more detailed than you need to know, but the important concept here is to understand that the energy released during catabolism, so going from large to small, is used to help us synthesize more ATP. And so we use this energy that we're getting from the catabolic reaction to drive the energy needed for the anabolic reaction. So we're not just pulling this energy from thin air, we're using a breakdown to help us with a buildup. All right, this is a really, really good summary slide of how our pathways work. This is more detailed by a lot than you guys need to know, but this is a really, really good graphic to kind of hang on to and keep in your notes because it's going to help you down the line if you ever talk about nutrition a little bit more complex. Okay, our metabolic rate. So we said metabolism is the total sum of all the reactions in the body. So our metabolic rate is going to be that total amount of energy or the sum of all those reactions. And we're going to divide that by a unit of time. Our basal metabolic rate is the same idea, but it just refers to the energy needed to keep the resting body functional. So basal metabolic rate is if you were just laying still in bed, how much energy your body is using just to kind of keep our systems going. And this is how we're going to determine how many kilocalories or big C calories needed per day. So our two metabolic states are absorptive versus post-absorptive. So in the absorptive state, we're referring to our period immediately after our meal. So we're absorbing our nutrients. And so our nutrients are being absorbed through the small intestine, remember, especially within the jejunum, the middle portion of the small intestine. And so some of those nutrients are going to be absorbed into our circulatory system. And remember, the lacteals are going to absorb fats into the lymphatic system. This is going to be about 4 hours after our meal because we had to get through the digestive tract to the small intestine first. The glucose is going to go to our cells to be utilized, and the excess will be converted to glycogen or fat based on what we said. And so it's, and I shouldn't say or because it's really not one or the other. It's going to be some will be converted to glycogen. If we don't need to convert it all to glycogen, the rest will be deposited as fat into our adipose tissue. And then we also said we can't store amino acids, so they're just going to go right to being used in making new proteins. The post-absorptive state is going to follow the absorptive state. No surprise there. And so this is how we're going to maintain our blood glucose levels. So this is where we're going to now take that glycogen and convert it back to glucose because now our cells need that. We don't have any glucose that just came in. Now, if we don't have enough glycogen to break down, one of the other things that happens is we're going to start breaking down triglycerides. And so we can kind of go through a special process that is going to convert a substance called glycerol into glucose. So that's using fat to make glucose. The fatty acids going to acetyl-CoA is a little bit more than you guys need to know or really understand that process. Amino acids can also be converted to glucose. Doesn't happen a ton, but it is possible because our cells need glucose. So if we had to resort to proteins, then we could take amino acids and convert it into glucose. But this is really going to be our two main ways that we can kind of access those energy stores within the body. All right, we've talked about temperature in terms of negative feedback loops and positive feedback loops and homeostasis, but we're going to kind of hit it again in this chapter. And so we should know our average body temperature is 98.6 degrees Fahrenheit. And so remember, that will be what we consider our set point. And so the whole idea or how we maintain that average temperature is that we have to balance heat coming in with heat going out. And so temperature regulation is primarily done by dilation and constriction of our blood vessels in the skin, which is primarily going to be the arteries since they have the tunica media, that thicker muscle layer that allows them to change diameter. We also have sweat glands, and then our skeletal muscles can help with this too. So sweat evaporating off the skin is going to cool us down. And think about what happens when you're super cold, you start shivering. That's your skeletal muscles trying to warm you back up by generating heat. And so the amount of heat that we exchange between the environment and the body is going to be determined by a difference in temperature. So say we went into a room that was exactly 98.6 degrees, there's not going to be any exchange because we're already exactly even. But if I go in a room that's 120 degrees, my body's going to start soaking up some of that heat. If I go into a room that is super cold, my body is now much hotter than the room, so my body's going to give off heat more quickly. That should make sense to you guys. Remember, almost all of our homeostatic processes are going to occur via a negative feedback system. We need to oppose the change. So negative, think opposite, because we don't want something that's going in the wrong direction to keep going farther in the wrong direction, because that's what would happen if it was a positive feedback system. The change would be amplified. And so if you remember back to our nervous system chapter, the hypothalamus is primarily responsible for being the body's thermostat and helping control that negative feedback system. All right, so these are mechanisms for heat loss. So all of these are going to result in heat loss. Radiation is going to be gain or loss of heat as infrared energy. So there's not physical contact happening. We can gain heat radiating from the sun. And for the most part, if we come into contact with something that's cooler than the body, like water, we're going to lose heat via radiation. And I shouldn't say contact. If we're near something like water that's cooler, we'll lose heat to that water. Conduction is something that's in direct contact. So, for example, here, her feet are touching the sand, so that sand is conducting heat. Convection is a transfer of heat, and so that's going to be either to the air, to the water, convection from a breeze on our skin. And then evaporation is when we have liquid to gas. And the best example of that is going to be sweat evaporating off the skin. All right, this is just a little bit of a graphic to walk you through that negative feedback loop. So I'm going to simplify it for you a bit. And so remember, we have our set point right in the middle. If we deviate too far away from that set point, then the body is going to respond. So in this case, if we got too hot, then we would use some of these methods to help cool us back down, especially evaporation, which is our conversion of that sweat into heat loss, or we can vasodilate, bring more blood to the surface so that we have convection, where we have that transfer of our heat to the air. Now, if we go too low, if we need to bring it back up, then that's when we're going to constrict blood vessels so we stop losing heat out of the skin. And then something like shivering of the muscles could also help us go back towards that set. All right, so hopefully this wasn't too bad since some of this stuff was a review. Obviously, this is a bit of a smaller chapter than 15 and 16. So kind of 15 and 16 should definitely be your focus when you are preparing. Just don't forget about 17. And as always, if you have any questions, please reach out to your instructor.